So we have the potential to become just like the Buddha. So we're extremely fortunate to have this situation, the chance to create the causes for enlightenment. And even though enlightenment can seem far away, and in fact, it does take a lot of time to reach enlightenment. But even if we start now, aiming for enlightenment, having that as our goal, and directing the things that we do towards that goal. So this is especially true for things like meditation and study, spiritual practice. But even our ordinary actions like eating and sleeping and working can also be directed towards enlightenment if we do them with that motivation. So if we do motivate for enlightenment and do everything we do with the motivation of becoming enlightenment to help all living beings, then not only do our actions become the cause of enlightenment, but they also become the cause of every other good thing along the way, which includes all the realizations of the path, and also good rebirths in all our future lives, and every kind of happiness, good experience, good quality. So all of that comes, by the way, if we aim our actions for enlightenment, do things with the motivation of enlightenment. So see if you can bring that thought into your mind, that your reason for being here tonight, listening to this talk and doing the meditations that we're doing. The reason is to create the causes for full enlightenment, full awakening, Buddhahood, for the benefit of all living beings, our kind mothers. Okay, so at the talk given yesterday in Coeur d'Alene at the North Idaho College by Ling Rinpoche, he spoke about loving kindness and compassion, among other things. And I was sitting in the back of the room. I couldn't see the faces of the people in the audience, many of whom were local people, students, faculty. Maybe some of them were meeting a Tibetan Lama and Tibetan Buddhism for the very first time. I don't know. So I couldn't see their faces, but I could see the backs of their heads. And I noticed at certain points they were nodding in response to things that Rinpoche was saying, especially when he started talking about loving kindness and compassion. One of the things he said that I thought was really beautiful was how our very existence and our very survival are dependent on the kindness and compassion of others. Taking care of us when we were small, providing us with food and so on. And I could see quite a few people nodding their heads. And there was also a feeling of the atmosphere in the room becoming sort of more soft and gentle. Maybe it was my imagination, I don't know. But it seemed to me that he really touched people's hearts. And so I thought, being inspired by that talk, that I would also talk about compassion tonight again. Also this morning I was reflecting on how it seemed that Ling Rinpoche's way of talking, especially in a public situation like that, talking to the general public, he sounded very similar to His Holiness, the kind of things that His Holiness the Dalai Lama would say to the general public. And that's not surprising, because I think he's been very close to His Holiness for, most of his life, since he was a toddler, and of course the past life as well. And I just thought how wonderful that is, that he's doing this, because he's 50 years younger than His Holiness. So that means that hopefully these important points, these messages, will continue being spoken about and spread around the world for many decades to come. So anyway, so I thought I'd talk again about compassion. And 2 weeks ago, when I gave the talk here, I also spoke about compassion and also about suffering, and how it's important that we are willing to accept, acknowledge, and learn how to deal with suffering, both our own suffering and the suffering of others, if we want to increase our compassion. So, we can't expect to develop compassion and avoid suffering, leave that off on the side, not deal with it. But we also need to learn how to deal with suffering in a way that we don't get overwhelmed by it and end up with compassion fatigue, which does seem to happen a lot of these days to people, especially those working in healthcare professions. And one of the points that I mentioned on how to avoid compassion fatigue, how to avoid depression, despair, and so forth, and keep up our courage in dealing with suffering and helping people, is emptiness, understanding emptiness. The reason there is because the more we can understand emptiness, the better our understanding of emptiness is, the more we'll come to see that suffering is actually like a bad dream. As that story I mentioned from His Holiness Sakya Treason. And it's more like an illusion, like a mirage, not so solid and concrete as we normally think. And seeing the illusory nature of suffering will help us avoid falling into despair, depression, compassion, fatigue, and so on, and be able to keep up our courage and strength to be able to work on trying to relieve suffering as much as possible. So I thought to talk tonight about the combination of compassion and wisdom, which is a big subject, but I thought to talk about it by way of what are called the three kinds of suffering, three types of three types of compassion. There are three types of suffering too, but no, we're not going to talk about that tonight. We'll talk about the three types of compassion. And Ling Rinpoche did mention these the other day in his teachings here, in the context of the second verse of that text, the Song of the Four Mindfulnesses. So he just named them but didn't explain them. So I thought we can go through these tonight. They're really beautiful. And also do some meditation on them to try to have a little bit more experiential understanding rather than just an intellectual understanding. Okay, so here they are, three types of compassion. And these are explained in Chandrakirti's Madhyamakavatara, sometimes translated as supplement to the middle way, or sometimes translated as entering the middle way. The middle way here refers to Nagarjuna's important text, the fundamental wisdom of the middle way, the Mula Madhyamakavatara, which is a very important text on emptiness. So Chandrakirti's text is a commentary to that text by Nagarjuna. So in that text, towards the beginning, within the first couple of verses, he mentions these three types of compassion. So the first is called compassion observing mere sentient beings. And I put mere in brackets because it's sometimes omitted, but we'll see later what it means. So this first type of compassion is just normal compassion. It's compassion for sentient beings, and it comes into existence by seeing how they suffer, seeing that they have suffering, wishing them to be free of suffering. So it's kind of just simple, ordinary compassion. The second is called compassion observing phenomena. And this is, as above, compassion observing sentient beings, wanting them to be free of suffering, but it's influenced by a realization of impermanence. So somebody who's realized impermanence, when they look at sentient beings and see their suffering, they also see sentient beings as impermanent, changing moment by moment, not so solid as they appear. So that realization of impermanence has an influence on their compassion. And the third type of compassion is called compassion observing the unapprehendable. So this is, again, compassion. It sees sentient beings and wants them to be free of suffering, but it's conjoined with or influenced by the realization of emptiness of inherent existence. So a person who has realized emptiness would look at sentient beings and see that they're empty of inherent existence. They don't exist inherently or objectively or independently. So they have that awareness of the nature of sentient beings, but they still see their suffering and want them to be free of suffering. So we'll go through these one by one. So don't worry about writing it all down now. But before we do that, just to mention, this is something Ling Rinpoche mentioned the other day as well. All the three types of compassion have the same entity. There's two aspects of them. The first is, these are technical terms you find in texts, Buddhist philosophical texts. Object of observation. The object of observation is sentient beings. That simply means compassion is a state of mind, and every mind has an object. A mind, a state of mind, can never exist without an object. There's always an object that's observed. So in the case of compassion, what is the object is sentient beings. And then the second part, the second aspect is called the subjective aspect. That has to do with what's actually going on in that mind as it's looking at sentient beings. What is it doing? What is it thinking? So the subjective aspect is wishing them to be free of suffering. So all the three types of compassion are the same in this respect. They all observe sentient beings, and they all have this subjective aspect of wishing them to be free of suffering. But then they are different, okay? So this is what they have in common, how they're same, but there are differences between them. So the way in which the three types of compassion are different is according to whether or not the compassion is preceded by and supported by some other realization, such as the realization of impermanence or the realization of emptiness. So in the mind of the person who has the compassion, if there does exist one of these realizations of impermanence or emptiness of inherent existence, then that realization would influence the compassion, would have an effect on the compassion. So if that doesn't make sense, you can ask later and I'll try to clarify it if I can. But let's start by looking at them one by one. So the first is called compassion observing sentient beings or mere sentient beings. The reason the word mere is there is because it just looks at sentient beings, observes sentient beings, and it doesn't have this influence of a realization of impermanence or a realization of emptiness. Okay, so it's just seeing sentient beings who are suffering, wishing them to be free of suffering. And this verse, so this is the verse from Chandrakirti's text. It's homage to that compassion for migrators. Migrators is another term for sentient beings who are powerless, like a bucket traveling in a well, through initially adhering to a self, an I, and then generating attachment for things. This is mine. So the idea behind this is that to really have compassion for sentient beings, we need to know what kind of suffering they have, how they suffer, and also why they suffer. Why do they have suffering? So the why they have suffering, is explained in the last two lines of the verse. So sentient beings, and that includes us. Well, me anyway, I don't know about you guys, but I'm still very much a sentient being. So those of us who are still sentient beings, we have this innate, inborn, instinctive belief or grasping at a false sense of self or I, sense of I. We're born with this. We carry it. with us from past lives. You've probably heard that before. It's not something new. So we come into the world. As soon as conception happens, our mind is there. And within our mind, there's already this grasping at an I, a me. And the I that we grasp at is actually false. It doesn't really exist. It's like a hallucination, a creation of the mind. But we don't know that, so we grasp at it. So that's the meaning of initially adhering to a self, an I. And then, on top of that, we generate attachment for things. Things can mean our body, parts of our body, my eyes, my hair, my hands, my legs, and so on, my brain, my heart, and also our mind, all the different aspects of our mind, my thoughts, my feelings, my emotions, my memories. Okay, so we have attachment for all the things we regard as mine. And mine can also include other people. My mother, my father, my brother, my sister, my partner, my child, my friend, and so on. And also material things. My clothes, my car, my phone, my computer, my books, whatever. Okay, so zillions of things we can regard as mine. Okay. And then, on the basis of this, the sense of an I, and then mine, the I, the false sense of I, taking the role of owner, being an owner of my things, and being attached to things. So this situation leads to lots of problems. We create karma, and then karma becomes the cause of suffering in the future, and so on and so forth. But this is the basis, this is the root of where our suffering comes from. And then how we suffer, what kind of suffering we have, is in the first, mainly the second line, where Chandrakirti says, we are like a bucket traveling in a well. That's a rather obscure analogy, needs to be explained. And Lama Tsongkhapa does provide the explanation of that in his commentary to Chandrakirti's commentary. So just a picture of a... This is the kind of thing he's talking about. Old-fashioned. I guess they still exist. Probably people still have them in certain parts of the world. So you have this well going down very, very, very deep, and at the bottom there's water. And then I think it's called a windlass, the thing on the top, the frame. And then there's a crank to turn it, and a rope wrapped around it. And the bucket is tied to the rope. Okay, so you throw the bucket down, and then you turn the crank to bring it back up again. Okay, so that's the idea. Keep that in mind. So Lama Tsongkhapa says that there are 6 ways that sentient beings are like a bucket in a well. First one is that we are bound by afflictive emotions and karma. So just as the bucket is tied to the rope, it's not free. It can't walk away. It can't say, I'm tired of doing this. I'm going to go and do something else. So it's tied to the rope, tied to the windlass. So it's not free. So in the similar way, we sentient beings are not free because we are tied by the rope of karma and afflictive emotions, greed, hatred, ignorance, and so forth. So we're bound in this way. We're not free. And if that's not clear, we just look at what happens when we try to sit quietly, for 5 minutes and feel peaceful and, have a peaceful state of mind. But usually, our mind is bombarded by all kinds of unwanted thoughts, many of which are not at all peaceful, don't bring us peace and happiness. Instead, they make us anxious and unhappy. And so that's one of the symptoms of this state of being bound by karma and afflictions. Also, we don't really want to get old, we don't want to get sick, we don't want to die, but without choice, this happens to us. This is due to karma and afflictions, all these unwanted problems. And the second is we are controlled by a mind that is afflicted with delusions. So the bucket is controlled by the person who operates the windlass. The bucket doesn't get to do what it wants, but if a person comes along, throws it into the well, makes it bring up water, So the person who operates this mechanism, causing the bucket to go up and down in the well, is in charge of the bucket, is in control of the bucket. So in a similar way, we are not really free, but we are controlled by our mind, our consciousness, which in turn is not a pure enlightened mind, but is a mind that is, full of afflictive thoughts and emotions and karma and so on. So again, we're not really free. On number 3, we go up and down in samsara again and again. So just like the bucket, this is what the bucket does. It goes up and down, down into the bottom of the well, and then up and so on. So in a similar way, as we go from life to life, we've already had, as they say, we've had countless lives before this, and we will continue to have many lives after this until we get free. So as we go from life to life, we go up and down. Sometimes we're in the hell realms, the worst places of suffering, and other times we're up at the very highest realms. There's actually a realm called the peak of samsara. It's like the penthouse of samsara. The most wonderful experiences possible in samsara, but you don't stay there forever. Your karma runs out, and again you go down. So we are going up and down, never resting, never able to just stay peaceful in one place or one situation. And we easily fall to lower realms, but need great effort to take birth in upper realms. So the bucket, when it goes down really quickly because it's empty and the force of gravity, so it easily and quickly falls down to the bottom. But in order to bring it up again, it takes a great deal of effort, really hard work, because water is heavy. So in a similar way, sentient beings in samsara, it doesn't take much for us to go to the lower realms. That happens very easily, because it's very easy to create bad karma. It's very easy to get angry, to have jealousy, to have greed, and so on and so forth, and create negative karma, and that causes us to go down. But creating good karma and being able to get ourselves into higher states of rebirth is not easy. That isn't something that just comes naturally and spontaneously for most of us. We have to put a lot of effort into that kind of thing. Hello? Oh. The 5th one isn't very clear in the text. It seems to be related to circular movement. It could be the circular movement of the bucket going up and down, or of the windlass, the crank, I don't know, but some kind of circular movement. So what Lama Tsongkhapa says is there's no definite order in the 3 groups of the 12 links. Does anyone remember what the 3 groups of the 12 links are? Yeah, afflictions. There's 3 afflictions, and then action. 2 actions, and then 7 results. So the 12 links can be divided into those 3 groups. 2 actions, 3 afflictions, 7 results. And there's no definite order in these. They just keep going around and around. It's like the chicken and the egg, Whatever you point to, you can't really say, well, it starts here. That's where it starts, because that came from, some other causes, and that came from other causes. So it's like this, and also with a circle, you can't really point to the beginning and the end of a circle. It just keeps going around and around. So that's as much as I can make understanding of that one. Last one's easier. We are constantly battered by different types of suffering. So the bucket, when the bucket's going down, it bangs against the side of the well. It's probably stone and hard. So it gets battered as it's going down. It also probably gets battered going up again. So it's getting battered as it goes up and down. And in a similar way, as we are going up and down and around in samsara, we are constantly battered by the different kinds of suffering, like the 3 types of suffering, the 8 types of suffering, and so on. So I thought maybe we could just do some meditation on this. It's quite a powerful analogy. And see if it can help us generate compassion for ourselves and other sentient beings in samsara. So when doing this meditation, if you want, you can think about all the sentient beings in samsara in all the 6 realms: human realm, animal realm, hungry ghosts, hell beings, devas, asuras, or jealous gods. Or if it's more comfortable, you can think of just a limited number of sentient beings. You could think of your family, your friends. You could think of all the people here in the community. Or even just one sentient being, if you'd like. So the analogy given here by Chandrakirti and Lama Tsongkhapa is that we sentient beings are like a bucket in a well in 6 different ways. So one is that just as the bucket is tied, not loose or free to be taken here and there, but it's always stuck to the windlass by the rope. So we too are tied up, bound by the ropes of disturbing emotions, ignorance, believing in a real I, inherently existing I, and also seeing everyone and everything else as inherently existing, which is completely false, completely wrong. We're seeing everything in a mistaken way. And we have other disturbing emotions like hatred or anger or dislike towards anyone or anything that appears in a threatening or harmful or unpleasant way. And we also have attachment, greed, craving, clinging towards anyone or anything that appears in an attractive, pleasant way. And we feel, oh, I want that. I want to own that. I want to keep that close to me as much as possible. So these 3 toxic states of mind, 3 poisons, disturb our peace of mind constantly, day and night. And on the basis of these, we are motivated to engage in actions or karma. We create karma. And any karma we create under the influence of one or more of these poisonous states of mind becomes the karma to experience suffering and problems, or just to be stuck in samsara, to perpetuate our existence in samsara, cyclic existence. So try to get a sense of how we are not really free because of the presence of afflictive thoughts and emotions, and karma in our mind, in our lives. And the second point is that we are under the control of our mind or consciousness, just as the bucket is controlled by the person who operates the mechanism, the windlass. So depending on our mind, what our mind comes up with, the thoughts, the emotions, the impulses, then we find ourselves sometimes happy, sometimes unhappy, wanting to do good, wanting to do bad, often feeling just very confused and troubled, disturbed, anxious, and so on. Again, we're not really free, but we're under the control of our mind, which in turn is afflicted. And then, just as the bucket is going up and down again and again in the well without choice, we too go up and down throughout the different realms of cyclic existence. Some of the realms are really horrible, terrible. The 3 lower realms, being born as an animal or a hungry ghost or in hell. Some of the realms are wonderful, blissful, especially the highest realms, the form and formless realms. So we travel all through these realms. We've already been in all of them many times in our past lives, but none of them are permanent abodes. They're just temporary places before we move on to the next one. We try to get a sense of how we never stay for long in one place, but we're always moving like a traveler, sometimes in pleasant situations, but sometimes in very horrible, painful situations. And the fourth point is somewhat related to that. When we do go down into the unfortunate realms, the lower realms, it happens very easily, quickly, spontaneously. It doesn't take much effort. Just as the bucket, when it goes down, it falls quickly to the bottom of the well. But to be able to go to the upper realms, be born in human or deva realms or the asura realms, it takes a lot of effort. We have to create a lot of good karma. In the same way that for the bucket to come up again, it takes a great deal of effort. And then the fifth point is that the bucket is operated by turning the crank in a circular movement. And a circle doesn't really have a beginning or an end. It just keeps going around and around continuously. And in a similar way, our existence in samsara occurs due to the 12 links. That's the real explanation of how we are stuck in samsara. It's because of these 12 links, which are primarily mental states. And 2 of them are actions, 3 of them are delusions, and then there are 7 results of actions done under the influence of delusions. These are operating in our mind all the time on a daily basis. We can't really point to a starting point. This is the beginning and this is the end, but they just keep going around and around. While we're experiencing the results of one set of 12 links, we are at the same time creating more 12 links, more causes for more rebirths and more experiences in samsara. And then the last point is, as the bucket goes down and up in the well, it gets battered against the side of the well, which is probably made of hard rocks or bricks. And in a similar way, as we are going up and down in samsara, we are battered by the different kinds of samsaric sufferings, like the 3 kinds of suffering: suffering of suffering, suffering of change, pervasive suffering, the 8 kinds of suffering, the 6 kinds of suffering. So there's many different kinds of sufferings in samsara. So in each life, especially in the lower realms, we are subject to so many different kinds of suffering. So we're just constantly battered by different kinds of suffering, without choice, without control. So see if you can generate a feeling of compassion for yourself, for all sentient beings who are in this situation. If it's hard to really feel compassion, then you can just repeat to yourself some phrase like, I wish all sentient beings to be free of suffering, or how wonderful it would be if all beings could be free of suffering. So just saying those words to ourselves a number of times can help make our mind more familiar with this feeling of compassion. So I have a question for you. Do you think that the compassion that ordinary people have, for example, people who aren't exposed to Buddhist teachings, if their child or their pet or friend, someone they care about is sick or in pain or unhappy, depressed, they feel some amount of compassion. But how does that compassion compare with the compassion explained here, the compassion explained in Buddhism? You think it's the same or different?
I noticed, since we've been studying this book on sharing the Dharma days, an open-hearted life, which is all about compassion, that, and we've had the discussions, we have discussion groups in the Sharing the Dharma Days. I've had an opportunity to listen to a lot of people talk about their experiences of compassion, and I've kind of decided that it's not what we talk about most of the time. There's often many other things going on that we wouldn't identify in Buddhism as compassion, that they are identifying as compassion. Sometimes it's personal distress. Sometimes it's actually a lot of self-concern. Not, the object isn't the other person. That's kind of common. There's definitely compassion there, but so, some of it, but it's usually mixed with a lot of other things.
Also, too, as part of this learning about compassion, too, is that people continually need to be reassured that by having compassion, as the woman said yesterday at NIC, is they're not becoming doormats of the world. It's hard to convince people, or it takes a while for them to turn their minds to realize that this state of mind is an extremely courageous, an extremely precise, an extremely wise kind of mind, that it's not just, overwhelmed by your emotions and feeling paralyzed by your feelings, and people taking advantage of a good heart. So to get them to really understand it's a very, very strong and powerful mental state.
I think what's really standing out to me is that somebody who is not exposed to Buddhism normally doesn't have this wider view of multiple lifetimes. So the compassion they talk about is, as Venerable Sangye mentioned, much more biased towards those who have helped them. Like their dog comforts them, their parents, raise them, and for those people, I think the compassion rises a lot easier. But without having that multiple lifetimes perspective, I think the compassion that is directed outwards is more of a I'm still lost in my word, but it's definitely different.
So I have a thought and a question, and reasoning through this, I'm sort of hearing that there's this exclusivity around compassion in Buddhism. But if I follow some thinking, which may be wrong, if we all have Buddha nature, whether we're exposed to the Dharma or not, then I believe compassion is attached to this Buddha nature in some way. And so then if every sentient being has Buddha nature, is there not at least the potential for this compassion? So I'm a little confused about the exclusivity of someone exposed to the Dharma and compassion.
No, I didn't mean to imply that when I asked the question.
I'm not saying anybody did. I think that's just sort of what I'm hearing, in that, there's a difference between people who are exposed to the Dharma and not. But when I go back to if everyone has Buddha nature...
No, you're right. I agree completely. And the
so
Dalai
I'm not
Lama.
sure about this division, so that's what I'm asking about.
No, I mean, the Dalai Lama talks about this, that everyone has compassion. It is part of our Buddha nature. It's part of our, what's called a developing Buddha nature. All the good qualities that we have in our mind, those are part of our Buddha nature. So everyone does have compassion and love and wisdom. We all have them. Every sentient being has compassion. But what I guess I'm trying to point out is there are different forms of compassion, or different levels, different degrees of compassion. I think everyone does have compassion. Even animals have compassion. So, but I guess what I'm trying to point out is that the way Buddhism explains compassion is, I think, vaster, because, as Matt pointed out, it takes into account not only this lifetime, but multiple lifetimes. We've had many lives before, we'll have many lives after that. So probably most people don't believe in other lives, so their view is just the suffering of this life. So I think that's one difference between Buddhist compassion and...
That makes sense to me then.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Venerable Chunyi would like to say something, and then we'll pass it over.
I also think there's a big difference in because of the different levels of suffering that are identified in Buddhism. That generally in society, all we see the terrible suffering of suffering,
First
mental
type of
pain.
suffering,
Yeah, the
yeah.
first type of suffering. But the deeper understanding that even our pleasurable experiences are also in the nature of suffering because they're so short-lived, they don't last. They can never make us lastingly happy. And then the very bottom line of the pervasive suffering is something that's really hard to even grasp until you've thought about it a lot and heard the teachings. So with that kind of mind looking at a suffering, it becomes much, much bigger, deeper, and there's more hope then within the context of Buddhism too, because there's something we can do about it.
Yeah, that's another important difference. We can be free of all this suffering and its causes. You got the microphone.
And
you can talk.
also without the view of karma, then I think people without that view will more easily go into personal distress. They want to feel compassion, but it's like we're helpless. There are all of these things happening to people and we don't understand why they're happening, or there's some being that's making it happen, so that karma element is not there.
So someone online said that the compassion of the average person is not based on equanimity. It's probably quite partial.
Yeah, that's another thing. I guess Jake was trying to mention that as well. Yeah, we have compassion for our loved ones, our close ones, but not necessarily everybody else. That's not necessarily true. I know some people who have really open minds, open hearts, but probably majority of people, yeah, their compassion would be more limited. So I don't mean to be, pointing out I'm not, trying to imply that we Buddhists are somehow better, we have better compassion, and I didn't mean that, but just it is the way it's explained in Buddhism. I think it is quite different than what most people who have any sense of compassion in the world would understand. But I'm not trying to put down people's compassion, because I think any little bit of compassion that people have, even if it's only for their puppy or their cat or whatever, or their child, it's certainly better than having no compassion at all. And that's like the basis, we have to have compassion for at least one person before we can have it for others. Yeah. So even to have, a little bit of compassion is fantastic. Because there are people who are, well, even though they have the seed of compassion, but it may not manifest very often in their life, and instead they may be acting in harmful ways.
I think sometimes there's also a confusion about that compassion means you have to be in a certain distress with the other person, like
Be in a what?
in a certain place of distress with the other person, like to kind of get on the same level with them with their suffering, that's the way to connect, or entering into that personal distress or that state of confusion is not what compassion as presented here is about. It's got a wisdom mind to it.
Yeah, I talked about that last time. The word compassion can mean suffer with. So some people have the idea that when you have compassion for somebody, you have to be in the same level of suffering that they are. And the Buddhist, the terms like in Sanskrit and Tibetan and Pali don't seem to have that same connotation. It's more like a very noble heart, or a heart that's moved and touched by the suffering of others, but there's no connotation of having to suffer with them. And in fact, to be able to really help others, you need to be in a calm, peaceful state of mind. Imagine if a little child is crying, hysterical, if the mother starts crying and becomes hysterical too, is that going to be helpful? Right? So the best thing is for the mother to be able to stay calm and cool and wise, caring, of course, but at the same time wise, and able to know what to do, what to say to help their child be free of their distress. So that's the way I see, ideally, compassion operating.
Just want to emphasize once more to Venerable and Tapas, and that the real source is seen in Buddhism of suffering. That I think you don't find in other traditions or in regular society. The real source of suffering is the blindness of our ignorance. And that's what you want to point out, I guess, tonight, the connection between compassion and wisdom.
Yeah, it's one of the beauties of Buddhism, explaining where does suffering come from, how to stop the causes of suffering and be free of it. Okay, just want to quickly look at the last two types of suffering. I mean, compassion. I'm saying that. So number 2 is called compassion observing phenomena. So this is compassion that is preceded by and supported by the realization of impermanence. So this kind of compassion would only be found in the mind of someone who has a realization of impermanence. And that doesn't just mean you know about impermanence, you can talk about it. It means you actually have a realization of it. Subtle impermanence, not just gross impermanence, but subtle impermanence, where you can deeply understand how everything is changing moment by moment. Nothing stays the same from one moment to the next. So a person who has this realization, they see sentient beings, and they understand that sentient beings are changing every moment. They're not the same from one moment to the next. And this realization would influence their compassion. And this person, because they realize impermanence, they also realize that sentient beings do not have a permanent, unitary, and independent self. Those who've studied tenets, this is a kind of self that certain non-Buddhist schools assert. And it's one thing that marks the difference between Buddhist and non-Buddhist schools. Some Buddhist schools, like in India, at the time of the Buddha, they said there was such a thing called an Atman, or a soul, something permanent and unitary or partless and independent. So they actually believed in that kind of a self. So a person who's realized impermanence, is totally free of this kind of view. So they also realize sentient beings don't have that kind of a self, and instead that a sentient being is just imputed to a collection of aggregates of body and mind, a collection of parts, physical parts and mental parts. Just a whole bunch of parts, and on top of that we label person or sentient being. And later, Lama Tsongkhapa says later, sometime, at some point, this person will also realize that sentient beings are empty of a substantially existent self. So that is another kind of self that is falsely created, falsely imputed by ignorance. Lama Tsongkhapa says it's also an innate, inborn ignorance that we all have. Everyone is born with a view of a substantially existent self. And this is a kind of self that seems to be a different entity from our aggregates. And in our personal experience, it sort of takes the form of a boss. Like, this sense there's something inside that's like a boss, a director controlling the show. You can notice that sometimes if you watch your mind. There's something inside that's making decisions, controlling everything. So that sense of an I who plays that role is actually false. It's not true, not really there. It's just created by the mind. So with the realization of impermanence, you gradually come to see that kind of a self also doesn't exist. So with this compassion, then, you look at sentient beings, and you see that they are impermanent, they change moment by moment, and they don't have any kind of permanent self or soul or Atman, and they also don't have this substantially existent self. self that's like a boss in charge of everything. Instead, they see that sentient beings are merely imputed in relation to their aggregates, the physical and mental components that make them up. And that's why this kind of compassion is called compassion observing phenomena. Phenomena refers to just the aggregates. We're just a mass of phenomena, physical and mental phenomena, labeled sentient being or man or woman or dog or cat or whatever. Okay, so it's just labeled on top of a bunch of phenomena. So this then leads to a kind of deeper kind of compassion. Still it's compassion. It sees sentient beings as suffering and wants them to be free of suffering, but it has this additional aspect of understanding sentient beings as impermanent and so on. Okay, the third type of compassion is called compassion observing the unapprehendable. So this is compassion that is preceded and supported by a realization of emptiness of inherent existence. So this would only exist in the mind of someone who has realized emptiness. And so a person who has this realization would see sentient beings as lacking inherent existence, and that realization would influence their compassion. They see sentient beings and they understand sentient beings. There's no inherently existing sentient beings. Sentient beings are merely labeled on top of their aggregates, but they still suffer, and you want them to be free of suffering. So you have compassion for them. And the term unapprehendable doesn't mean you can't see them, but it means you don't see them as truly existing or inherently existing. So what it means is compassion observing sentient beings who lack inherent existence or true existence. And the line in Chandrakirti's text related to this, he says, homage to that compassion for migrators seen as evanescent and empty of inherent existence, like a moon in rippling water. So this line, or two lines actually, covers both of the two kinds of compassion. They're sort of intermingled. So Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary says, Chandrakirti's homage to compassion observing phenomena, compassion number 2 is homage to compassion viewing migrators as evanescent or momentarily disintegrating, like a moon in water stirred by a breeze. So the image is a lake, imagine a lake, and it's night, the moon is full up in the sky, and it's casting reflection on the surface of the lake. And, in that kind of situation, sometimes you look at that reflection of the moon in the lake and it looks like the real moon. It's hard to tell which one is the real moon, which one is the reflection. But the surface of the lake is stirred by a breeze, so the image of the moon is actually rippling, moving. So that rippling effect of the moon in the water refers to the second kind of compassion. You see sentient beings as not solid and permanent, but as constantly changing, made up of atoms, particles, mind moments, always changing, never the same from one moment to the next. And then his homage to compassion observing the unapprehendable is homage to compassion viewing migrators as empty of inherent existence, although they appear to exist inherently, like the reflection of the moon in the water. Okay, so just the reflection of the moon in the water represents the empty nature of sentient beings, because just as the reflection, you see the reflection of the moon in the water, and it looks like the real moon. It looks like there's a real moon in the water, although it's not. It's just an appearance, just a reflection. So in a similar way, sentient beings and everything else appears to be truly existing, inherently existing from their own side, objectively, and so on. So there's this appearance of that form of existence, but that form of existence is actually false, not true, not real. So a person who's realized emptiness would see that appearance, but know it's not true. Was the an example? Remember, she gave the other day of somebody who lies all the time. Somebody who's always lying. So that person comes and starts talking to you. You kind of know, oh, I can't believe what this person is telling me. There's lots of other analogies as well. One of my teachers used TV. Right? Television or movies, you look on the screen and you see all these people and things happening and it looks real. Somebody who just came out of the jungle, never saw TV before, would think they are real, but we know it's not. It's just an appearance, but not real. So the reflection of a moon in the water is often used in the text as an analogy for emptiness. Sorry, a lot of words there, but I just wanted to share this. This is from His Holiness, a book called How to See Yourself as You Really Are. Wonderful book. So he's explaining this analogy, kind of elaborating on it. A reflection of the moon shimmers on the surface of a lake, rippled by breezes. A huge river of the ignorance that mistakenly believes the mind-body to be inherently existing flows into the lake of mistaking I as inherently existing. So the lake itself represents our grasping at I, believing I inherently exist. And then there's a river flowing into the lake, feeding the lake. The river represents grasping at things as inherently existing, grasping at phenomena as inherently existing. So that's the situation. And then the lake itself is agitated by the winds of counterproductive thought and of wholesome and unwholesome actions. So in other words, delusions and karma, those are the winds that are stirring the surface of the lake, making it not calm and smooth, but agitated. The shimmering reflection of the moon symbolizes both the coarse level of impermanence due to death and the subtle level of impermanence due to the moment-by-moment disintegration that rules sentient beings. The shining of the rippling waves illustrates the impermanence to which sentient beings are subject, and you are to see sentient beings in this way. This lake isn't rippling though, but we can pretend, we can imagine. I did find some pictures of rippling, but then it didn't really look like a moon, it just looked like a mass of light. So we've got a bit of time left. I thought we could either do a meditation on this, or if you prefer to ask questions.
How does the knowledge or experience of the three levels that you've explained affect the action of the person who's intending to give compassion? Whether you see a person at each of these levels, how does this change your compassionate action or feeling toward them?
That's a good question, and that's not explained. I mean, I haven't come across an explanation of that, so I could only guess, I could only imagine, but I would think that the more wisdom one has, wisdom of impermanence, wisdom of coarse selflessness, wisdom of subtle selflessness, emptiness, the more one has wisdom, the more one's actions would be affected by wisdom as opposed to mere compassion. I mean, I would think a person who has the first level of compassion, yes, they see sentient beings as suffering and they wish to help them and they will do what they can to help them. But if they lack wisdom, then they may not fully understand what is the best way to help them. Whereas the more one understands emptiness, that would, I mean, just for example, having the understanding of emptiness, you would understand why sentient beings are suffering, where their suffering is coming from. And so you're in helping them, you're helping them not just putting band-aids on their cuts and saying soothing words to heal their depression, but you would also want to help them realize emptiness. Of course, that's a long-term goal, but you see that the way of helping sentient beings goes far beyond just taking care of their immediate needs. That's one thing that comes to mind. Also, I would think that, well, this isn't really so much your question, but like I said at the beginning, the more wisdom we have in our mind, the more calm we will be able to remain, not become so distressed by or disturbed by or, unhappy about the suffering that's out there. But, it gives so much more courage and strength to keep going and helping sentient beings. So that's more to do with affecting the person themselves. But as far as their way of acting, way of behaving, I couldn't really say, because I'm certainly not there at that point. But it just seems to me that, their actions would be imbued with much more wisdom.
And maybe more accuracy.
More what?
Accuracy.
Accuracy.
Like,
Yeah.
I can have a spontaneous feeling of wanting to help that comes very sincerely, very quickly, but I might make the mistake of not having to go backward and resort to NVC and say, but what are you feeling now? How are you feeling now? Rather than assuming. I guess at the more advanced level, you're less likely to make the mistakes of assumptions in the accuracy of how you help. Is that?
Yeah, because also on the Bodhisattva's path, I mean, this is mainly talking about the Bodhisattva's path. So on the Bodhisattva's path, the Bodhisattva will also not just meditate on wisdom, but also develop concentration. And with deeper and deeper concentration, they will attain these higher levels of mind, which give you certain psychic powers like clairvoyance and other powers that you can use to help. You can see the minds of sentient beings, and you can know more accurately what's going on with them, what would be most helpful to do, what wouldn't be helpful to do, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of not talking so much about wisdom but concentration, but still it's a necessary part of the path to really help sentient beings.
I always wonder what motivates a bodhisattva or a Buddha to help others if they realize that they're not inherently existent. I mean, they know that there's no concrete entity there that's suffering, so why do they feel the need to help, especially if they don't feel distress over the situation, because their mind is always filled with joy. And usually my understanding is that people feel compelled to help because it disturbs them at some level.
So you seem to be saying that bodhisattvas and Buddhas who understand emptiness and there's no concrete inherently existing sentient being. It sounds like you think that means there's no sentient being there who is suffering.
In a sense, yes.
Okay, well, that's not what they see. I mean, it is a tricky point, but emptiness is not nothingness. Emptiness means the sentient being doesn't exist in a certain kind of way, i.e. inherently existing, independently existing, so you kind of wipe out those modes of existence that are false, not true. But you have to maintain that there is a sentient being there, even though they're not inherently existing, but they still have a body and a mind, karma, delusions. They feel pain, they feel hurt, they feel sad. even though it's only because of their karma and delusions, but for them it's real. Just like the person who's sleeping and having a nightmare, you can look at them and say what's going on with them isn't real, isn't true, but they're in the middle of that. And for them it is true, it is real. They're really scared or whatever, in pain. So the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas know that. They can see, yeah, there's no inherently existing sentient being, but there's still a conventionally existing sentient being there who is suffering. Yeah? For them, it's real. And actually, what I've heard is the more you have wisdom, the more you have compassion. Because you understand so clearly that that what's going on with that sentient being is not real. But they believe it's real. They believe it's true. And you can see it's only because of their ignorance. And so your wish to help is even stronger than before. They say the more we understand emptiness, the more our compassion is increased, enhanced. You can see so clearly that all the suffering we experience is only coming because of delusion, ignorance. It's all created by the mind. So then you really, really want to help sentient beings wake up and realize that and get out of this suffering. So instead of having less compassion, you have more compassion. That's what they say, those who've experienced it. Yeah. So does that make sense? Well, that's really important to understand because it is easy to slip into thinking, well, if there's no inherently existing sentient being, then why bother? You know, they're not really there anyway. They're just an illusion, a dream. So, but yeah, that's not the right understanding. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. They see them as dependent arising. So, I mean, they understand.
Yeah, dependent arising, conventionally existing. Yeah.
And then it sounds like they want to just spread joy and happiness. That's why they want to help. It's not because they're disturbed by the suffering. It's that.
Yeah, I think the joy, like the first bodhisattva ground, there's 10 bodhisattva grounds. The first one is called the joyous one. And that ground is attained when they have a direct realization of emptiness on the basis of compassion and love and so forth. So at that level, this is an Arya Bodhisattva who's directly realized emptiness, and they have this incredible compassion and love, which they've been working on for a long, long, long time. The joy they experience comes from the realization of emptiness. It's not like, joy because, people are nice to you and you're having a good time. It's your realization of emptiness that gives that incredible joy. And they want to share that with others. Yeah, they're not attached to it. They want to get everyone into that state of experiencing that same kind of joy through seeing the true nature of things, through waking up and realizing that we've been living in a dream. We've been asleep all this time. All our suffering is just because we don't see things correctly. So they really want to share that with others, wake them up too. So yeah. So I thought we could do a bit of meditation on this analogy and this image, which is really beautiful. Try to get more understanding of the second and third types of compassion. So try to sit up straight. You may be feeling tired, understandable after all the hard work of the last week, or more than week. But just try to keep awake a little bit longer. Try to sit up straight. But at the same time, don't be tense. Let your shoulders relax. If you are feeling sleepy, you can have your eyes open a little bit so there's light coming in. Bring your mind back in case it's wandered away. Put aside other thoughts. Just try to focus on the meditation that we're doing right here, right now. So as in the last meditation, you can think about all sentient beings if you want, or just a certain number of sentient beings or just one sentient being, just to get some idea of what's happening with us sentient beings in samsara. And first contemplate how we are impermanent. We are made of mainly two things, body and mind. Our body is made of many parts. Parts are made of parts down to extremely minute particles like molecules, atoms, subatomic particles. And all of these are changing. They're not frozen, static, but every moment, every nanosecond, they are changing. Not the same from one moment to the next. Our mind, the other main part of us, is also changing all the time. It's made up of many different parts, like 6 types of primary mind and the 51 types of mental factors. Each moment of mind is like a bubble. It appears, lasts a moment, then it disappears, and the next one immediately arises. The mind is not a fixed, solid thing sitting inside of us like a machine, pumping out thoughts, but it's just a stream made up of momentary mental events, arising and passing, changing all the time. Again, never the same from one moment to the next. So this is how we are, this is how all sentient beings are. We're just a mass of physical and mental components, shifting, changing all the time, every second. And if we deeply understand this, we will also understand there's no self or I that is something permanent, unchanging, unitary, whole monolithic thing without parts, and independently existing, independent of causes and conditions. So that type of self or soul or I that is believed in by certain religious or philosophical systems, according to the Buddhist view, it's false, it's not true. It's just a creation of the mind, not really there. And clinging to such a self is actually a cause of suffering, something that keeps us longer in samsara. Try to imagine that you've got that realization that we and all other beings are impermanent, changing every moment, and empty of a permanent self. So imagine what it would be like to see sentient beings in that way, like the reflection of a moon on the surface of a lake that's stirred by a breeze, so it's rippling, changing constantly. But although we are changing all the time and we don't have a permanent self, we still suffer. Sentient beings do suffer. We have suffering in our body, we have suffering in our mind, and our suffering seems real to us. And therefore, we do deserve compassion. So feel compassion for sentient beings who are changing every moment, momentarily disintegrating. So you can just say to yourself some phrase like how wonderful it would be if all beings could be free of their suffering, physical suffering, mental suffering, and the causes of suffering. And then, at a deeper level, sentient beings are also empty of an inherently existing self. So this is a self that seems to exist from its own side, independent of anything else, causes, conditions, parts, mental labeling. Seems to stand on its own, autonomous, objectively existing. So we are all born with a belief in such a self, instinctive, inborn, grasping at that kind of self, and most beings never question it, they just go along with it. But in reality, that kind of self doesn't exist. If it did, we would be able to find it when we search for it. For example, if we know a person named John, and when we see this person over there, we immediately think, there's John. That's John. John is coming. But what exactly is John? If we look through all the parts that make him up, all the parts of his body, down to the cells, molecules, atoms, is there anything we can point to and say, that is John? Or if we look through all the parts of his mind, all the bubbles of mental states that arise and pass every moment, can we point to any of them and say, that is John? So if we really take the time and carefully search through all the parts of John, physical and mental components that make him up, we won't find anything that is John. But that doesn't mean John doesn't exist. He is there, he does exist. But the way he exists is just labeled. That which is merely named or merely labeled in relation to that collection of physical and mental parts, body and mind. So John is just a convention, a name, a label given onto his aggregates. And the same is true of every other person, every other living being. They appear to be real, inherently existing, but they don't exist that way. Similar to the reflection of a moon in a lake. It appears like a real moon, an actual moon, but it's not. If we investigate it, we don't find the moon there on the surface of the lake. But again, sentient beings do exist conventionally as merely labeled dependent arisings. And they do experience suffering, physical suffering, mental suffering. And so they deserve our compassion. So generate compassion for sentient beings while understanding they don't exist inherently as they appear. How wonderful it would be if they could be free of all their suffering and the causes of suffering.